Today we're going to be talking about Claude for RevOps as well as just all AI and how there's a massive opportunity out there to leverage these tools in these rapidly and changing environment to take the RevOps or sales ops, marketing ops functions more from tactical to strategic. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by two of the biggest voices and brightest minds in the RevOps space. The first of which is Jeff Ignacio. Jeff, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Quentin. My name's Jeff. I run a go-to-market advisory firm called Rev Ops Impact. It's a combination of my Substack called the Rev Ops Impact newsletter, the Rev Ops Review podcast brought to you by another GTM firm, and then my own advisory firm where I practice revenue operations and actually more recently a ton of AI operations projects.
Awesome. Great expertise to be bringing to the table, Jeff. We're lucky to have you. And then we're also joined by Unify's own Hassan. Hassan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm Hassan. I've actually known Jeff for a couple of years as well now. Cross paths in the RevOps world, but I have been in revenue operations for almost a decade. Started from sales operations, and I have earned the stars from working from high growth startups to private equity backed companies, VC backed companies, ran my own consulting, and now leading this charge with AI powered RevOps at Unify.
Awesome. We're really lucky to have you guys on the call today and have a ton to dive into. With that in mind, I would love to just dig in. We're going to do this panel style and maybe even show some demos of what you all have been building. But just as we dive into that, I want to start off with a question more broadly than just RevOps, but how are you seeing a lot of change has been happening in AI over the past few years, but seems like the start of 2026 has maybe been one of the biggest inflection points. I would love to hear from you guys. Maybe Jeff, we'll start with you about how you've seen the AI landscape changing so far in 2026.
I think quite a few changes with AI. It's moving so fast that it does feel a little overwhelming. I would say one of the killer use cases that folks saw was automated outbounding and moving beyond token personalization to like really hyper relevance. And these are like buzzwords, but really going the extra distance to composite really interesting outbound campaigns. That's like the first killer use case. And then my brain immediately goes to, okay, look, what information can we enrich at our source of truth layer? And then where can we impact our system of record and then the engagement layer? I like to solve for it from the bottom up while others are looking at the top down use cases. Another thing that's interesting is as a thought partner, I find AI to be incredible, right? Not only does it have its web search capabilities so you can get the collective wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, it also breaks down problems into multiple steps and actually sometimes sees things that I may not be thinking about. So it's a very strong reasoning partner. And then from a build perspective, the build versus buy conversation is clearly putting a few more points on the board for build, which I think is hugely fascinating. And if you're a seller, it has to be one of the most frustrating things to hear when someone says, I think I can build that. And you used to only hear that from tech forward companies. Like, why would I buy your software? I could just go build it ourselves. But now you're hearing it from companies that don't have developers. So it's just really interesting to see how things are changing.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's great perspective. Hassan, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm seeing the same thing within the industry as we are deep into the weeds. We're seeing a fundamental shift on how people are approaching AI as well. If you go 6 months, 8 months in our very recent history, models were popping up here and there, people were using it, but the conversations were like, hey, how are we using AI? Are we using AI? Now the conversations are how fast can you deploy this using AI? So it's a foundational like change because the table stakes are like already there. And now it has, to Jeff's point, like 2 months are an eternity in the world of AI. A lot of things happen in 2 months. So it's the race against time. Teams are actually going in, starting building. Now Claude just like supercharged, brought a lot of things into the mainstream and everyone's, yes, I am building out a bunch of use cases. So it's fascinating to see how the speed which is moving.
I can double down on how both it can be overwhelming at the same time. If you're probably in this room, you're probably at the cutting edge at the end of the day. I think at the end of the day, if you're operating maybe the software or tech space, like most teams are at the forefront of this, it's always good to reflect on the fact that you're trying to stay ahead of that knowledge and learn from people doing things differently. It's great to hear. The next thing I want to dig into is obviously you both are longtime RevOps practitioners and experts on that space. I'd love to hear how you've seen the RevOps space specifically adapt with AI, how the perception of the role and change has changed, maybe the responsibilities and what that's evolving to over time.
Yeah, I can kick off. I would say anybody here who has worked in RevOps probably knows that RevOps itself is like one of the most like under-resourced departments, and we have a pretty significantly important role. Holding data that is the impact of that is huge, but there was always this, hey, I need more resources. There's lack of resources. What AI does is takes that argument slightly away from the team, and they're like, okay, now if AI is deployed at your disposal, where can you actually start taking all these tactical items and start becoming strategic? Again, that was another topic in the world of RevOps that has always brought up, hey, how can I be more strategic versus I get pulled into all these things like a sales manager needs a report. Okay, great. Now that took a lot of time away from working on those, hey, how do I deploy AI in all these areas? How do I bring the ROI, talk to leadership, take a seat at a table? So I would say the way I see it, and I don't know, Jeff, if you resonate, but I've seen it almost as, hey, I just hired a world-class analyst and I can delegate a bunch of my technical work directly to that and could be a strategic thought partner. And that is just a huge change in how RevOps has approached. And it's just a new way of doing things.
I'd agree. I'd say there's a couple of everyone has their own different use case. Like every time I talk to another peer, I find that they're building something totally different than the last person. But I think some of the most interesting use cases I've seen, one is someone that is a first line defense on your tickets. So someone sends us a Salesforce case or a linear ticket or something in Jira to the RevOps team. The ability to actually have a first line responder is incredible because then it carves away a lot of the small tactical ask away from the team and can reprioritize time towards higher value added responsibilities. One second use case that I've seen is an agent that actually reads like contracts through OCR, takes the parse text, identifies what to fill out, and that helps with the close one and the deal desk processes. So more than automated outbound, you can actually get into the nitty gritty of the actual sales motion. I think that's hugely interesting. I don't know. I find that the landscape has changed quite a bit. You have an additional set of hands, an additional set of eyes and ears. I've seen one CRO go to another extreme, which is they installed Claude bot across their entire stack. I wouldn't do that, but they've done it. And I can tell you that from the preview that I saw, it's doing all sorts of lead enrichment, lead scoring, assessing and routing leads. It's also doing some of the initial deal shaping and scoping. So it's pretty incredible. There's a wild west out happening right now.
Yeah, which is where I think, and Jeff, my view is I believe revenue operations sits in this like amazing opportunity to control and have that strategy deployed across, because an AI model to be significantly better than any other AI model is like context, right? You start giving it context, and revenue operations, when it sits in the middle of all of this, like I know which fields, I know what workflows, I know all of that stuff. So if you were the person that they'd be going back to and asking for the context, you were in a perfect place to actually build and deploy AI across your organization. And to your point, yes, a CRO can go in and start like breaking everything or without having the context. But if it actually goes through RevOps, you can deploy it much faster and more efficiently and securely. But yeah, otherwise left to their own devices, it could be people can blow it up.
I'd push back a little bit. I think you could actually have, depending on the CRM you have, you can have an agent read the schema, understand it, read the API metadata, understand the reports that are most often used, the filters that are on them, the reporting behind it. And it could actually work backwards towards context. So yeah, there's ways around it, but I do think eventually these AIs will be as good. You can send out a swarm of AI agents into your infrastructure and it could probably build a pretty strong knowledge graph of well-established businesses, for example, but a business that may not have processes, then there's nothing to look for.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think, yeah, established documented Notion pages that have all of that stuff and your field guide probably easier. I lean towards what I've seen in startup because it's chaos. And like I'd be like, yes, this person owns all these records, but like I know that this person doesn't work here anymore. It's an inactive. Yes, Claude can eventually find inactive users and active users from the schema. A little bit hand holding, but you're totally right. Like in a larger company where process is well established, much easier to deploy, and it will only get better.
Love hearing some of this. And I can't emphasize enough. RevOps is in like an interesting position too, because at the end of the day, you are the ones who've been on the front lines of building processes and automations and trying to make your teams more efficient. Now that trend is evangelized across all teams looking to do these same things. RevOps has a real opportunity there to be this thought leader for an entire organization and how you can move it forward. Awesome. This is great context. Before we get into some of the use cases, something that from our earlier chats was coming up was that AI is honestly only as good as oftentimes the inputs that come with it. So would love to hear from you guys. What are some of those prerequisites or steps you recommend people take before deploying AI into their workflows?
Jeff, if you want to go.
Yeah, I'll go first. Let's think out loud here because I've built so many things and run into so many issues. I think the first thing is not every model is created equal. So you have different foundation model providers. OpenAI has their ChatGPT models, Claude with their Anthropic models. And when you say the models, you're talking about Opus, Sonnet, Haiku, and you want to know exactly which provider, which foundation model you might want to use and work backwards from your use case. And so when you think about your use case, sometimes you're just doing a classification exercise. If it's a classification exercise, you really don't want to use a model that costs $3 per million tokens. It's too expensive. You want to use a model that's 15 cents or 20 cents. I obviously understand that token costs will probably come down over time. At this day and age in 2026, you want the appropriate model for the task at hand. Second, when you're calling these LLMs, it's an API request and response. If you think you're going to get the same quality as speaking into Claude.ai, the chat window, you're not. You have to carefully construct these systems somewhat differently because Claude.ai is a very good product. It's almost religious to use. So if you're thinking of building it into an N8N or a Make workflow or even pulling it from Unify to get the same response back, you really have to massage it and really think through how you architect your AI. So it really comes down to not just using AI, but architecting your AI altogether. The third thing is obviously prompt engineering is still important. You give it in context windows. So context windows, just for folks who may not be aware of it, you can't just shove an entire like video series into one call into an LLM. It just won't work. So you have to be very mindful of what you send in. And the second is the prompt. If you don't send the right context and the right constraints, what will happen is high chance of hallucination. And that was very apparent in 2024, less apparent in 2025. But when you still work in deep data, as much as I think Hassan and I do, you'll notice that it will hallucinate if you don't give it the right constraints.
Yeah, and I would say even on the flip side, if you give it too much information, that's where it's also going to start breaking, right? It's going to be like, oh, I can read like 15 different tools, but now it's starting to stitch together a story. I would add basically a little bit more here is from my side of things, I would say what is in revenue operations, like day-to-day control is like building out some of the foundations, even to what Jeff said, like Claude can go in and read the schemas and all these stuff. But if it was not really set up properly and it was all chaos in there, your LLM is as good as what it's pulling from there, right? So setting up like solid foundations early is what revenue operations does, but now it becomes a lot more like compounding effect here, and then you layer up like AI on top of that, and the use cases start making a lot more sense. So yeah, putting that foundations early is probably the way to go, and then testing it out in your models. And to Jeff's point, you can easily burn a lot of tokens in trying to do a lot of that. So it's, Jeff, I think you mentioned on LinkedIn, it's almost like a resource, right? It's like how you spent water. Like you want to make sure like you are doing it effectively and not, hey, I have 1,000 ideas I want to deploy everywhere, but there's no ROI for like half of them. So you just have to be cautious in deploying that.
That's great insight here, guys. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like at the end of the day, if you're not doing your prerequisites, you're not like setting those foundations in place, the outputs or what you deliver really isn't going to be set up for success. So once you've done all that, I think the thing that most people are here to understand more about is what are the different ways and use cases that you're applying this within the scope of RevOps functions. There's a broad brush amount of use cases and just responsibilities, jobs to be done in the revenue operations role. So we'd love to hear from each of you, and maybe Hassan will start on your side of some of the use cases you're applying Claude and broader AI to today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where you start is probably a good place because Claude has 3 modes that you can start in chat, you can work in co-work, you can go and code. The way I have been leveraging is, and I know Jeff, you'll talk about like more towards like use cases that you've built out in code. I find my sweet spot is in cowork, and chat is like a very good thought partner to have conversations. Hey, I want to draft up like territory management. Having that like back and forth in chat is actually amazing. But cowork has been a game changer for me because the way I started with is, okay, what are these tasks that I do on a daily basis as an operator that takes me X amount of time? I know those are important. That's why they're on my list. But how can I start picking those up and automating that into an agent that has a very fixed context window? I have a skills file there as well. It's within a project, and I'm starting to build this, and it's shipping stuff. And a good example I will give is I built out a closed lost agent. Like now, and this is where it gets very fascinating and interesting because I, as a human, did not have all this context with 5 different tools that I wanted to bring in. Historically, how you would do a closed loss analysis is, and Jeff knows, like we'll pull a Salesforce report, look at lost reasons, look at all the stuff like why the rep has lost this, maybe some notes there, taking all of that and spinning it up to the leadership. Hey, this is why we're losing. Now what I'm able to do, I connected that CRM context. We use Attention as a call recorder tool, has an MCP connector. I know all the calls on that deal, and I can actually assess, did the rep actually put it into the right category, or are we losing for a very different reason? So I just dumped all of that in, and my drop downs were probably not capturing every single thing. I started actually, it went beyond and told me like, hey, there's 3 other reasons that you're not capturing today that we have learned over the calls. Then I add more context into it because we use Slack, for example. There's internal conversations happening in Slack. There are external conversations happening in Slack with amazing amount of context that I would have never gotten to. Took me 5 minutes. And I have all of that stuff in, and I'm running analysis on, hey, tell me, schedule it into your Slack. Every week, I'm getting a report on what's happening in last week, why did we lose, and then a last 90-day look that I'm actually sending to leadership saying, hey, this is what we are looking at in terms of trend. But curious to hear, Jeff, like how you've gone beyond on that and built out in code and deployed those apps as well.
Yeah, so I have an engineering background before I moved into finance. So I've always been handy at Python and SQL. And so to see when I talk to the LLM, you'll actually see it, chain of thought. It's creating Python. And when you ask Claude, like, why do you always create Python? The reason it does that is because it says, you gave me a general purpose question, and I need to come up with a very specific answer to your questions. In the absence of a solid standard framework, it's going to generate custom code. That's why it does that. So for the use cases that I put together are really 2nd order and 3rd order metrics that I want to provide to like my clients, for example. So I work with CMOs or CROs, and the standard report you give on Monday is, okay, what's the state of our pipeline? Where did our pipeline come from? You can get that data from your CRM pretty easily. But then when you combine it with something like conversational intelligence solution, and I'm happy to share a couple of examples of it, it gets much richer. So for example, like have you ever met a sales rep who had back-to-backs all day, and then at 4 p.m. they're so tired that they can't actually fill out the CRM correctly, and they have maybe like an Evernote or some sort of scratch pad on the right-hand side, and it's just really hard to have memory recall to have all the details filled in. That's what Claude Code could do really well. It could take the call via API as the trigger point. It could take the transcript, take all sorts of really rich metadata, such as who spoke, was the thing they said, was that a question? Does that question comport to some sort of sales framework that you're thinking through? Qualification framework, a sales process approach. You might be using MEDDPICC, MEDDIC, gap selling, spin selling, Miller-Heiman. You might be using all of it. And then the idea of, okay, let me take that synthesis and then write back into the CRM. So that way you take a lot of the administrative burden, right? Because we think about an old framework of how much time does a seller actually spend selling, right? Is it external or internal activity? Internal selling, external selling, internal admin, external non-selling. So you think about this 2x2 quadrant. So AI is extremely good at that. So one example would be build a Claude bot or something that would take your transcripts and then do all sorts of cool metadata with it. So for example, here's the state of my pipeline. How much of that pipeline is stale? That pipeline stale is pretty easy to read. If there's no activity going on for a long time and it's been sitting in that stage for a long time, that's pretty easy to detect. But then there's another flip side of that, which is which deals are actually further ahead than what the stage suggests. The client brought up proposal or pricing. Okay, that's a red flag if it was really early. because then they don't really understand the value yet. So the value to price ratio is imbalanced, or they're right there. And what is raising rep laziness, right? They just haven't filled up the CRM. They haven't moved it forward. And it does happen. So there's all sorts of really cool cookie crumbs or trails that you can find adding AI into these type of workflows.
Yeah, and I would say, Jeff, like I was building this the other day, and I started giving it more context on my reps. I was doing forecasting analysis, and I'm like, oh, I historically know that this rep sandbags. Okay, amazing. Like now Claude has that context, and that makes the analysis even more powerful. The next time it's doing is, okay, I know the pattern of your reps, and yeah, it's a force multiplier if you actually add a lot more data points. That again, revenue operations, I think, is in a great place because we know all of that to build this out.
Would love to dig in a little bit further. Hassan, maybe I'll start with you. I know there was a use case you wanted to potentially give a little more direct glimpse into. Do you mind speaking a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can do a quick screen share and just show folks here something in action. This is literally something I was building yesterday. So it's an actual agent that I was deploying. So I'll show you a little bit of like how I ran the prompt. And let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we can.
Awesome. So again, the way one of the hacks that I've used, and I'll give this away, is what Jeff mentioned, like the prompt engineering piece. I actually delegate that to Claude. So I have a skill that is here. So I do dash prompt enhancer, and I have my prompt, which is, I would say I got like fair amount of context in here, but Claude just went in, looked at my metadata and looked at the Salesforce schema and said, oh, I think when you're saying new business, you mean opportunity type new business. And it already knows that I'm talking about new business. So it's exclusive expansions, renewals, all of that stuff, forecast category names. It actually just started taking that apart and enhanced this into almost, hey, what's the action? Like original, what's the intent? Then what the action needs to be. Again, like we use Spice internally. So I was like, hey, there's all these notes there for Spice. It actually went in, which is like mind blowing. It started going in and started finding the fields that are applicable that I didn't even actually talk about. It's like building the filters. So now I have the action. It's saying I need to pull attention data. I need to generate like almost a postmortem. And the goal of this was, anybody who's worked in RevOps knows, there are deals that reps will say it will close this month, and they never do, especially if they're sitting in commit. So I was like, okay, I need to know more context than like me asking the rep, hey, why did this close? Or me bringing it back every week. We have leadership call on forecast, and I have to bring it up and say, guys, this deal actually slipped, but I can supercharge that analysis. So I'm like, okay, I have this. You have your attention calls. Go through all the calls, do a postmortem, look at all the Spice notes. Tell me what is missing here. What was the risk here that the rep actually flagged? Then go through my calendar, look at the forecast leadership meeting that is coming up. And before that, I need this information in my Slack and compose it in a Slack. Tell me the original close date, root cause, rep missed, what the recommended action should be. Historically, this would probably take me 2 to 3 hours. Like every time I pull, get the context, because I have to go into these tools, find it, draft it in Slack, bring it to my leadership. This has worked like a charm. Again, like here, it actually started going into the filters itself. It says I need output format. So again, the anatomy of this prompt is almost like I have intent, action, data sources, filters, output format I need, metrics, then go into the connectors. It has the dependencies here and a little bit of guardrails, like what not to do, right? Again, once you start enhancing all of this, and I'll go maybe all the way down here to show you like how, and this is a mock deal, how it comes through. So for example, I'm like, hey, this is the ARR, this is a rep. This is something that I actually never told Claude, but Claude was like, hey, I'm gonna have the push count because it's a standard Salesforce field. And it will tell me how many times it has pushed. So that's the risk factor. Is, oh, this is a dark deal. There is no call scheduled. Here, for example, like champion verbally confirmed, and it's actually giving me versus all of these calls, the root causes. This champion was not mobilized to economic buyer. So we haven't, the rep was relying on this optimism, but nothing was confirmed in terms of there's no executive alignment. Again, spiced, medic, whatever you use can only enhance this analysis. And yeah, this comes into my Slack at the end of the month. And I am having those conversations in a much powerful context with my leadership team. Again, almost impossible that I would do this like every single month with people who are here. I saw in chat as a team of one or two. This is almost like being too like tactical. Now I did all of this work and now I'm being strategic. I'm just having the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great to see Hassan. Like I've seen that in real time where Hassan will share out this like learnings for the team, like the execs are like chatting about it and making like strategic helping advise on strategic decisions with it. So it allows like RevOps to get that seat at the table, be a strategic operator and really have that presence. So it's great to see. Cool. Jeff, would love to hear on your end. I know you're leaning much more into the Claude code world and any examples you'd want to showcase today as well.
Yeah, I can do that. Let me share my screen. Okay, I'm gonna share my desktop actually. Let me just describe what you're looking at, and I'll tilt my head because my screen's to the right. First is a GitHub repo. I think you'll actually see the world of RevOps move much closer to getting comfortable with GitHub. GitHub is a great place to version control a lot of the projects you're working on. These are just a handful of projects that I've been building for clients. I'm much more in the vibe coding world. So I think of myself as a product developer, product manager for revenue operations. The product that I build is either killer processes, killer tools, killer operating cadences, killer reporting, and then hopefully a very good, successful annual planning motion. But let's focus on the systems piece first. So the first thing I did was build an application. So I have a consultancy. So I work with multiple clients at once, and the clients who do want to opt into a tool, building a tool like this. So this is my agentic layer that takes real data from your CRM and then beyond that actually processes it in a number of ways. So when you think about agents, I'm just going to show you this tool not to be a plug for the tool, but really to think about the architecture, right? So the very first thing is you want to feed an LLM data. And when you're feeding it like a CRM, it's too much context. You have to pare down, you have to filter down the results. The results could also be qualitative in nature. So you have to classify those qualitative fields, right? So very similar to when you're doing a multi-regression, you have to make it binary, 1 or 0, or somewhat discrete in terms of the results. And so when you think about this, as give an example, let's say you want to work with a deal object, you'll want to be able to determine which fields you're filtering for and getting that data out and then putting it together. And that's the data set that will feed your LLM call. And so when you take the LLM call, you want to package that into what I call a skill. This is the purpose. So this is what I would build for like on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. You might do a pipeline hygiene check. You might do a deal risk assessment. You might work on pipeline recap at the end of the week prior to going into your client on Monday. And the goal is to build what I call an agent. An agent should have, sorry, I love video games. So you think about an 8-bit character. These agents, you give them a goal. So the goal should then be something that they have that one goal in mind. Sorry, start from scratch. So you give them a goal, then you give them the tools. If you use N8N or Make, you know this, you're plugging into your HubSpot, you're plugging into your Google. And the idea is to say you have the ability to read and write and take action on my behalf. And you can gate how much of an action you want it to take. Are you human in the loop? You want complete manual review, or go wild. Your Claude bot, just do whatever you want and take action, right? Right into my CRM, send an email on my behalf. I don't care. I trust you completely. And the goal is that when you think about an agent at the end of the day is a while loop, right? In coding, a while loop is you just keep going until you satisfy this condition. When that condition is met, you break the loop, right? So you can make these agents as smart as you want, and you can raise the bar of the exit. So you just keep going. The good thing about an agent is it doesn't sleep. It just keeps going. As long as the server is up and the trigger and the crons are working fine, the agent will just keep going. And so the goal would then be you can build this yourself. I actually think most apps are going to end up being reduced to a Slack command at the end of the day. And it's natural, right? Instead of clicking around, you just have things working in the background, /chat, and then all of a sudden all these things happen in the background. And this thing should have the ability to have a conversation. I think ops are going to start moving to a world where you have Claude Code on one side. I like to work in terminal. Some folks like to work in desktop. Some folks like to work in cloud. It's all the same thing. The context windows are slightly different depending on which version you're using. Like Claude Code on mobile, like you can't give it that much context. It won't do well. And then you have to know what model you're working with and then how to put all these models together in conjunction. So let me show you some real life like examples. So I was working on a territory planning project with another client. I've hopefully anonymized all of this correctly. Hopefully I don't get in trouble. So here, this is a territory exercise, right? So if you've ever designed territories in revenue operations, you know reps complain when you give one territory that's 2x more lucrative than another territory and you don't adjust the quotas, right? It just makes it that much easier for one rep to make their money than the other. And so you want to be able to find, okay, what should go in a territory? How much should go in a territory? What are the heuristics that I would use? So for example, in this case, this is a company that sells A/B testing software for websites. So if you want to do website experiments, marketing teams, growth marketers are going to use this. You'll want to have some sort of formula. And in this case, the formula is simple. This is the number of, they're still seats based, they're not model based, but they're thinking that some companies will have a certain base seat. You'll have an industry multiplier. Some industries just do better than others. You can track this through NRR or win rates, and then you give it a license multiplier of some sort. So this times this tries to come up with an estimate of how much that account would be worth. And all of this was done through Claude Code. I had Claude Code pull in the population of data in companies, enriched through an enrichment provider. And then I had to go back and forth. And by version 8, it literally couldn't get it right for the first 4 times. So as smart as Claude is, it still doesn't have your judgment. It doesn't know your schema. So you can actually poke holes in its reasoning until you get to a really tight place. And I think that's wonderful for AI operators. Another one is, I'll show the last example would be a scorecard on your sales reps. Are they good at their jobs? They can give me a scorecard too to tell me if I'm good at my job, and that's fair game. But so this is going through all of the sales calls. This client used 2 recorders. They use Fireflies and they use Apollo. Some reps use Apollo, some reps use Fireflies. It's very hard to do reporting because you have to split systems. And so what we did is we analyzed all of the sales calls. We analyzed the calls so you can see the headline, how many calls were analyzed, how many deals did it impact, and then we scored Medic, right? Now, Medic, you have to train it to go over the transcripts and look for specific markers, identify who said what to who, and then assess, put a rubric together. So you can design this process, then build the code to go do it. And then you have to feed the Claude, or whatever agent you use, whatever LLM you use into it. I wouldn't use Claude for the classification step. I would use a low-level model like Claude Haiku, not Claude Sonnet, sorry. Or if you're bold, you can even use like something like DeepSeek, right, on a Fireworks API. That would dramatically bring down your costs. And for 15,000 accounts, I think my estimate was $30 to analyze the entire history of this particular sales team. And then I can show like what did Medic average, and then do a time series. Did this rep improve over time? The reps who are regrettable attritions versus non-regrettable attrition, was there a difference between the two? Did improvement in their Medic correlate with an improvement in performance? So you can get to the second order, third order, fourth order questions that you probably did not have the time to go do because you were still building surface level reporting. At least I was.
And this is a great example, I think, Jeff, like of like large enough data set that like you want to be a little bit efficient on the models. So that's a good call.
Awesome. This has been great, guys, and great to see both of these examples in action. One question that came in that I would love to hear you talk to, and I'm going to flash up a slide on this while you guys speak to it, but I heard one of the questions was, what are the highest ROI use cases for Claude Code or AI in general in RevOps? Hassan, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say the way I've broken it down is almost like revenue operations, like analyzing if I went through like my list of projects, what are the highest ROI projects there, and this accelerates that, right? So if I'm like, for example, here doing like win-loss analysis in chat, or there's a ton of deliverables that RevOps has on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, and spinning it up to leadership. For me, it's actually going to make my entire motion way more efficient. But then what I'm doing is like, I'm actually going down and sitting with the key stakeholders, finding out the highest impact ROI things and doing my judgment on it. As a RevOps leader, I've already done that like previously without AI. And what I'm doing then is doing analysis on, okay, which of these things are something that I can actually delegate that happens faster? You actually go through your entire backlog. Again, like going back to under-resourced teams have this crazy amount of backlog. Some are good high ROI things and some aren't, right? Some you have to push back and say, hey, this is not a priority. That game doesn't change. It's mainly like where can you apply to get the fastest dollar ROI here. To me, I think like all these analysis that I'm spinning up to the leadership, that usually took me a week maybe to put. Now it's taking me a couple of hours. The leadership is making those decisions so much faster versus what they used to, and that proves the ROI to the leadership. And then if you can actually put a dollar amount to that, again, have have Claude do that for you. But if you can actually put a dollar amount on that ROI and spin it up to the leadership, I think that speaks that language, and the ROI is starting to get proven. But I'm curious, Jeff, how you've seen that.
Yeah, so different folks are going to use models from different surfaces. Sorry, I was trying to tackle some of the questions. Some really interesting ones seem to be coming through.
Yeah, one of the big pieces was, Jeff, what is the highest ROI use cases of AI and Claude for specifically in RevOps?
So signals are a really nice one to work on. Signals are great. So for example, if you can identify executive appointments, news around, that are particular triggers for whatever your services are, I think that's compelling. The great thing about signals is they can get really noisy real fast. So you turn signals into noise. So you want to be able to synthesize that and weight them correctly. Just like any sort of lead score, they have a decay factor to it. So I think that that's hugely interesting. I think the second one is getting insight into the deals. One of the most frustrating questions that I come across is our pipeline real, right? And our pipeline can be understated or overstated. On average, it tends to be understated, and that's why we tend to track forecast snapshots on a weekly basis, right? Your week one, week two forecast is wild because no, you haven't cleaned up your pipeline yet. Then you get to like week three, week four, it's generally very conservative. Then you get to week eight, you're overfitting forecast again. And then you get much closer to like week five, week six by the time you end the quarter. That's why I see the largest lift is to get real signal from like how many deals are we actually going to close? Another one is sales productivity or sales effectiveness, right? One analysis that I did recently looked at a rep who had lots of activity, but then you actually looked at the subject lines, and the subject lines looked like they weren't personal. So almost all the emails were automated outreaches through the sales engagement platform. And so we weren't breaking through. So is that the rep's fault, or is that our sequence's fault? Or maybe it's our targeting in the first place. So we have to break down this problem into different pieces to identify what's the problem. Another one is I have a client that has a pipeline view. They have an initial land deal, which is like usually 1/5, 1/6 the size of their expansion op. And so because we weren't creating the expansion op, we weren't truly measuring pipeline correctly. So for example, like the initial POC or pilot is actually optionality. You want to know how many of those do we actually convert? And when we do convert them, what size expansion do we have? So that's your true pipeline is yes, we can get these POCs, these pilots, and they're painful to do because you're getting paid very little for how much work you're doing. But if they're proven successful, right, and you want to track why they're successful, now you get into the call data, right? You get into how many artifacts and deliverables are we delivering at pace? Does the client feel that they're getting value out of this like within a short time period? And those are questions that you can ask AI to do. It'll do its best to try to get the answer right with the data that you have at its disposal. But you go back and forth with these tools, and you should get to a place where you build the proper data scaffolding and get to a place where you've really tightened up your go-to-market motion.
And I think the interesting part is these problems are not new. The problems are old. The solutions are new, right? So if you see anything on that visual on the screen, these are all problems that revenue operations have been tackling and solving. And the ones Jeff just mentioned, it's like how you approach it. AI is a tool. So it makes it faster and more efficient. And the more context you actually start building it out, the more ROI it produces.
So love to hear that. And thanks for sharing there, guys. I know we're over time, have time for just two more questions here, and then we're going to wrap up. But you can always pass those along to myself with the follow-up email with the recording or connect with Hassan and Jeff. I don't want to volunteer to tell you to respond to everyone, but if you do have questions, they're obviously incredible resources to work with. The first question that came in is, what's the best way to orchestrate workflows using Claude Intelligence? You mentioned lead scoring and routing. Is that through a Salesforce MCP or something else? Jeff, I saw you nodding there.
Think about the lead flow, right? So lead flow is a form fill or a lead capture of some sort. The data, usually if you have a lower number of fields to fill out, you get a higher fill rate, but then you have to enrich the gap, right? The opposite is also true. If you ask for a lot of information, you get higher quality leads coming through the gate, but fewer, right? Because no one wants to fill out a form for some reason. Then you should fill the gap, enrich it. And then once it's enriched, you make a determination. So there's that lead scoring component. And then once it passes the score, you should then route. If you don't have a lot of leads, just route everything. But if you're in a place where your lead volume is going to impact your rep's ability to stay focused on higher level activities, then consider an SDR team. If you have an SDR team, they are overwhelmed, then consider scoring, right? So just work backwards from what you need. You can turn on the faucet or tighten it. So where you put AI, I would recommend the data provider first, because those tend to invest. They're already eating all the cost of investing to validate the data on your behalf. And then in the absence of that, particularly in very hard industries to get data, if you're selling to B2C, selling to restaurants, like sure, there are data providers, or there's really high turnover in the data set that you're looking for, right? So maybe there's certain industries where people just don't stay in their jobs for very long. Then you want to backstop waterfall or an AI tool. The data resolution is going to get a lot lower, but that's where I would employ like AI per se. But if you enrich correctly and you have a high data validation, then you don't even need AI. You just have classic lead routing.
Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. There's a ton of questions coming in, but yeah, we'll have to only, I think, narrow to just the one, maybe just one more here for the sake of time, so we're already running over. I think this one is great to hear from both of you on because I think it's very topical, but probably a lot of people here. I'm an overworked RevOps IC, realizing I won't get actual headcount this year. So I need to build a team of agents to scale my impact. Any advice for starting to do that? And that's from Anthony.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And again, like the reason why I keep on bringing that up, because I've actually gone through that pain myself. And what you as an IC want to maximize, again, if you drill down from what takes the majority of your time that you're actually consumed in your day-to-day productivity. Again, going back to revenue operations' entire job is to make all of the revenue functions more efficient. Start with yourself. Start with, hey, I spend this X amount of my time doing these mundane tasks that I can actually start delegating. That frees up your time. So you move from being like too tactical in your day-to-day into more strategic role. That makes you a very powerful IC because you're delegating and you're doing like jobs of probably 4 ICs in one. That's the shift I'm seeing that is happening. So I would say like where you start is again, like where does it hurt the most? That's where you start, right? You're like, okay, let's take this time away. And then once you are in a very good, if you're like jumping into it today, I would start there and then start going into your stakeholders, right? And then doing this assessment. If you were a doctor, you would start like, where does it hurt? And that's the question that gets you a trust building with all your team, but also start bringing the ROI because it's recognizable. As an IC, then you are gold. Like everybody would come to you, but you are able to execute 4x that you were, because getting headcount is way more difficult than ever before now.
So one depends. Yeah, I agree with Hassan, like where you should deploy AI. I think one, use it for get to a place where you can ask for incremental investment, right? And so when you think about incremental investment, it's because the business believes you're going to get outsized value for the dollars coming in. If there are elements of your work that you find yourself cutting corners or omitting because you just don't have the capacity and time to get there, that might be a great place to actually put AI in. The flip side of that is maybe deploy it where you are spending a lot of your time so that you can crush the time down in those areas. So there's two philosophies you can work with. One, put it to your superpower so you can reallocate the time to something else. But then you're reallocating time to something else that you're not probably particularly, that may not be your strong suit. The other area is have it cover your gaps, your weaknesses, right? One or the other. I haven't experimented with it personally because I haven't been full-time in using AI. I've only been a fractional like third party. So I'd be curious to hear from others how they deploy their AI. Next one is if you have the ability to work with your InfoSec team and get wider permission sets from your tools, particularly read-only, you can get to a really strong place of analysis across your entire GTM stack. But if you have write access, test it with a sandbox first before you point it to prod. But if you do have write access, you'd be amazed at what it can do. I cleaned up a company's renewal database that neglected the renewal process for the last 3 years. They were missing renewals from 2023 to 24. And then we had to go reconcile it against Stripe data, we saw that customers were still paying us, and then rebuild the 2025 renewal base based on the payments, and then built all the closed loss ops so we can do win rate analysis on renewal. And their renewal rate was much worse than they were actually thinking, what they've been pitching to their board. So
That's ROI right there. Yeah.
yeah, it's not a happy outcome, but it's, oh shoot, okay, hands on deck. Like we're churning customers. We need to plug this gap.
That's crazy. And I know, Quentin, we're not taking one more question, but I know this is a pain that I think Shay, you brought up in the chat, is there's no current good, like Salesforce doesn't have their own like official connector out so far. They have been, I think they did a partnership with Anthropic, so they're working on getting it out. It's currently only in sandbox and dev environments. But I would say in the meantime, I know it's painful. You mentioned in the meantime, there are connectors you can actually use. There's a connector called CData. Again, you need a connector that can actually has an MCP that can read a database. So you have the schema from there, and then you can actually also, unfortunately, I went deep in this rabbit hole and I vibe coded an MCP connector for Salesforce. I wouldn't recommend because it's a lot of going down, building out Apex codes and deploying it. But there are ways you can like have a middleware kind of feed the data in and get the analysis in the meantime. But yeah, that's a good question, and that has a pain. I've gone through that.
Thanks for that, Hassan. And yeah, that connector can't come soon enough on that front. Cool. I really appreciate everyone joining. There's obviously a ton of appetite of questions, and we really appreciate all the engagement. Jeff and Hassan, amazing resources. Thank you both for making time for this, sharing your insights, and hopefully there isn't too many people, but for engaging with the folks who do end up reaching out to you because you're obviously experts in the function. So with that, thank you all for joining. Stay tuned for more webinars like this from Unify, and feel free to share any feedback or questions you have with myself or the team. Thanks so much for joining, everybody.